The first time Yusuf heard the word vectigalia in al-Andalus, it came out of a Christian mouth, not from a bishop in a white stole, not from a learned man with ink-black fingers, from a farmer. They were standing at the edge of an olive grove, where the trees were old enough to look like they'd survived empires simply by refusing to move. The farmer had brought a small stool and sat on it, as if this were his land and time, and in every way that mattered to his life, it was. Yusuf stood, because standing felt like authority, and authority felt like safety. The farmer spoke in a Latin roughened by dust, the kind of speech you could hear in the markets, half law, half bargaining. He kept repeating a word as though it were a charm he'd used against other officials. Vectigalia, he said. Vectigalia. We've always paid. Under the Goths, we paid. Under the Romans, God keep their dead, we paid. So tell me, Lord, why does it feel like you are asking me to pay twice? Yusuf did not like the word because it sounded ancient, and Iberia was full of ancient words that had survived the sword. But he understood the complaint. He'd been sent from Cordoba with a leather folder of lists and seals, and a simple instruction dressed up as piety. Restore order. Restore revenue. Order meant keeping the peace between conquerors, who mistrusted one another. Revenue meant squeezing coin and grain and oil out of people who had no reason to love the new regime. People who were still the majority, still the muscle of the countryside, still the ones who actually knew where the water ran in summer. Yusuf's own community was small. In a city you might count them by the mosque courtyard on Friday and realize, with a faint chill, how few they were compared to the lanes of Christians crowding the same streets on Sunday. The conquest had been fast. Governing was slow. Every receipt, every oath, every treaty clause was a kind of rope stretched over a cliff. He opened his folder and let the papers breathe. He had copies of agreements, some signed in the first rush after 711, when towns had chosen submission over siege and autonomy over ruin. Those early arrangements were practical brilliance. The conquerors did not have enough men to garrison every place, so they made deals. The local order mostly remained. The Christians kept their churches and their familiar routines, and in return, tribute flowed. Empire, in those first years, had been a business arrangement with a religious stamp, but now the stamp mattered more. Yusuf's superior, a governor's man, impatient and well-fed, had spoken in the language of ideology. The Quran, he said, placed obligations and exemptions. Muslims gave alms. They did not pay the taxes that weighed on conquered unbelievers. The revenue of the state, the very bones of the new order, would come from the poll and land taxes imposed on the non-Muslim majority. Yusuf had nodded. He did not disagree. And yet here, among olive trees, ideology had a face. A farmer with cracked hands who had children to feed and saints he prayed to, and who feared that submission meant being slowly bled into emptiness. Yusuf knelt, an intentional act, not humility but tactic, and picked up a handful of soil. He let it crumble through his fingers. You pay, he said, because the treasury must live. The army must be paid. The roads must be kept from turning into bandit paths. The farmer snorted. The roads were bandit paths under the Goths too, Lord. Do not tell me you invented danger. Yusuf almost smiled. The man had nerve. Nerve meant he still believed the world listened when he spoke. That was both good and bad. A man who believes in language is a man who can be governed, if you choose the right words. I did not come to take your church, Yusuf said. I did not come to judge your prayers. The farmer leaned forward, suspicious. But you came to judge my fields. Yes, Yusuf thought. Exactly. He had learned quickly that Christians did not experience rule as theology. They experienced it as measurement. How many jars of oil? How many solidi? How many sons taken for labor? Whether the collector arrived with a smile or a whip. Whether the collector took the legal amount or took the legal amount plus a little for himself, plus a little for the men behind him. In Cordoba, Yusuf had sat in rooms where men spoke of law in clean categories. Muslim judges, qadis, were the conscience of the ruling community, the touchstone of orthodoxy, men whose approval or disapproval could steady a regime that shook with faction. But Christian law was not erased by that. Christians still lived under their own legal tradition, the old Visigothic code that had outlived the Visigothic king. There was even talk, quiet, practical talk, of judges of the Christians, men who settled disputes inside the subject communities, likely clerics, because the church still had the habit of organizing life like a spine. Organizes a body. Autonomy, Yusuf realized, was not a gift. It was an infrastructure. If you broke it, the countryside didn't become Muslim. It became ungovernable. He looked past the farmer to the small cluster of villagers who had gathered at a cautious distance. Women with scarves, boys with sticks, an old man holding a cross, he pretended, was merely a walking staff. Their eyes were fixed on Yusuf's hands, on the folder, on the seal, on whether he would point, demand take. Behind Yusuf stood 2 soldiers. Not many. That was the point, and the problem. 2 soldiers could enforce attacks today. They could not occupy a valley for a decade. Yusuf cleared his throat. "Tell me," he said, "what did you pay before?" The farmer hesitated. That question was dangerous, because it invited comparison, and comparisons were how empires died. But the farmer answered anyway, because he was tired, and tired men choose honesty like they choose bread. "A portion," he said, "and when the bishop called, we gave, and when the count called, we gave. Always someone calling." Yusuf heard it, not rebellion, but exhaustion. The Christian world was not a single block of faith. It was a web of obligations, lord, bishop, king, village, each tugging. So Yusuf did something that would later be called softness by the wrong men. He offered a bargain. "You will pay," he said, "as your treaty requires. Not more, not twice. And in return, I will put it in writing that your church keeps its property, and your priests may judge your people in your disputes, as long as you keep the peace. If a Muslim harms you unlawfully, you bring it to the city, and I will hear it." The farmer stared. Why? Because Yusuf needed the grove to keep producing oil. Because he needed the village to keep functioning. Because the treasury did not eat ideology. It ate grain. But Yusuf did not say that. He said, because the ruler who breaks his own agreements teaches people to break theirs. The old man with the cross staff made a sound that might have been a prayer. One of Yusuf's soldiers shifted, displeased. Yusuf could feel the weight of that displeasure like heat from a brazier. Soldiers had conquered by force, and now wanted the rewards of conquest to be simple. Take, distribute, move on. Administration was slow. Administration was compromise. Administration was, in its own quiet way, humiliation, because it required you to admit you could not simply do what you wanted. Yusuf sealed the document with wax. He pressed the stamp and watched the mark appear, crisp as a verdict. He handed the paper to the farmer. The farmer took it like a man receiving a shield. And that was when the destabilization came. Not from the Christians, but from Yusuf's own side. A rider appeared on the road, dust-plumed, and pulled up hard. He wore the look of a messenger bringing a message that would make someone bleed. "Yusuf ibn Sa'id," he called. Yusuf stepped forward. "Speak, Datul." The rider's eyes flicked to the villagers, to the paper in the farmer's hands. "New orders," he said. "The governor's treasury is short. The men are angry. You are to raise the levy immediately." The soldier behind Yusuf exhaled with satisfaction, as if justice had finally arrived. The farmer's fingers tightened on the treaty paper until Yusuf thought it might tear. Yusuf stood very still. In his chest, pragmatism and ideology began to grind against each other like 2 stones trying to make fire. He had promised peace in exchange for predictable tax. He had offered autonomy as the price of order. He had done it because he believed, truly believed, that empire lived or died by whether people could survive inside it. And now the treasury had spoken, in the oldest language of all. More, more. Yusuf took the rider's message without unfolding it. He already knew what it said. He looked at the villagers, at their faces, at the sudden shift from wary hope to familiar dread. The farmer said, softly, "So, twice." Yusuf felt, with a clarity that scared him, that this was the true conquest. Not the day Cordoba fell. Not the march through passes. Not banners on walls. This, the moment when an administrator decides whether law is real, or only a mask that slips when the hungry shout. He swallowed. He nodded once, not to the rider, not to the soldier, but to the problem itself, as if acknowledging an enemy he could not avoid. "Give me," he said, "until sunset." The rider frowned. "The governor wants coin, not sunsets." Yusuf's voice hardened. "Then tell him coin comes from people who still believe in tomorrow." He turned back toward the village, the olive trees, the treaty paper trembling in the farmer's hands, and he understood the theme of his life with sudden brutal simplicity. Empire is practical before it is ideological, but the men who preached ideology still needed someone to do the practical work, and that someone, for now, was Yusuf. By sunset, the valley air cooled enough to make the olive leaves hiss when the wind passed through them. Yusuf rode back toward the village, with the rider's message folded inside his sleeve, like a hidden knife. The two soldiers followed, boots thudding, their armor making that small metallic talk that always told people, "We are here, and we can do harm." He had asked for time, and time was a kind of currency. You spent it when you didn't have enough men. At the village edge, the church stood low and stubborn, its stones older than any treaty. A bell hung in a small tower, silent now, but Yusuf could imagine the sound. It wasn't the call to prayer. It was not his, but it organized their hours the way drums organize soldiers. He had come to understand that the church did more than pray. It kept records. It married, buried, admonished, soothed. It made promises feel real. He asked to speak with the priest. The villagers exchanged looks, and a boy ran off. Yusuf watched him go and wondered, not for the first time, how a conqueror's rule could hinge on a child's bare feet. The priest arrived with a cautious dignity, gray hair cropped short, eyes sharp in a face softened by age. He did not bow deeply. He did not spit. He stood between obedience and insult, balancing on the narrow beam most subject men learn to walk. "Lord Yusuf," he said, tasting the foreign name as if judging whether it belonged in his mouth. "You have influence here," Yusuf replied. The priest's mouth twitched. "We have habits. People listen to habit when they don't trust power." Yusuf heard the truth in it, and felt it land in his chest like a weight. Power could take. Habit could make people comply without feeling conquered. That was why the early agreements had left the church standing. You could strip a king from a people and still rule them through their priests. He unrolled his ledger on a stone wall. He had learned to do it openly. Secrecy bred rumors. Rumors bred knives. "This is what is owed," he said. "This is what has been paid." The priest leaned in, reading the figures with an ease that surprised Yusuf. Not every cleric was literate, but the ones who mattered often were, because letters were a kind of authority, older than swords. "And this," the priest said, tapping the page, "is what you are now asked to take." Yusuf did not deny it. "Yes." The priest straightened. "Then your treaty is a candle. Nice light. No heat." Yusuf bristled, pride flaring the way it always did when someone spoke plainly to him. He wanted to say, "You are alive because we conquered with restraint." He wanted to say, "Your king failed you." He wanted to say, "Don't confuse survival with dignity." Instead he said, "If I squeeze you too hard, the grove gives less. If the grove gives less, the treasury still demands. Then the soldiers take what they can. Then there is no law, only hunger." The priest studied him. "So you fear your own men?" Yusuf hesitated. The honest answer was yes. The ruling community was not a single mind. Arab commanders expected privilege. Berber troops carried resentments like stones in their pocket. The governor's circle spoke the language of God and order. But in the corridors a power coin still decided whose voice carried. "I fear disorder," Yusuf said. "It wears many faces." The priest nodded slowly, as if hearing something he'd suspected. "And what do you want of me?" That was the core of it. Yusuf could not make the treasury softer. He could only make the extraction less violent. To do that he needed the church, not as a rival, but as an instrument. "I want you," Yusuf said, "to tell your people this will not become plunder, that it is measured, that it will end." The priest's eyes hardened. "Will it?" Yusuf felt the interior crisis tighten. Here was pragmatism, demanding a lie, small, clean, for the sake of peace. And here was ideology, whispering that conquered people did not deserve promises, only submission. He heard his superior's voice in his head. "They are dhimma, protected, yes. But protected people pay. Protection is not free." And he heard the farmer's bitter word. Twice. Yusuf looked up at the church door. The wood was dark with age, scored by use. Above it, a carved symbol, cross, simple, worn down by weather and fingers. People touched it when they entered, the way Muslims touch the Quran with care. He suddenly imagined what would happen if he forced the levy now. He could do it. He had soldiers. He could take jars and coin and livestock. He could make an example. The valley would fall silent then. Silence was easy to govern, briefly. But silence also meant flight. It meant hidden harvests. It meant sabotaged irrigation. It meant bandits fed by villagers who would rather risk a knife in the dark than open their doors to another collector. Empire, Yusuf thought, is a stomach. If you tear it, it bleeds out slowly. He took a breath. It will not end, he admitted, voice low. Not soon. The conquest has made new needs. The state must pay men to keep order. But I can make it predictable. I can make it lawful. I can stop it from becoming whatever a hungry soldier can carry. The priest's gaze softened by a fraction. Not kindness, but recognition of the world's ugliness. And in exchange? The priest asked. Yusuf's fingers tightened on the ledger. This was where autonomy lived. Not in sermons, but in bargaining. In exchange, your church keeps its internal discipline, Yusuf said. Your disputes, marriage, inheritance among your own, small conflicts, you settle them. Your bishop may write to Cordoba through my office. Your property stays yours, as long as it does not become a fortress of rebellion. You ring your bell. You bury your dead. You keep your saints. He did not say the other part aloud, that these concessions were also convenient. If the church remained responsible for its own community, the Muslim administration could stay thin, could rely on existing institutions, rather than building an empire from scratch. The priest's eyes narrowed again. And if one of your men takes a Christian girl, or beats a priest, or seizes a field because he likes its water? Yusuf felt heat rise behind his ears. He had seen it. He had heard petitions. Abuse was not theoretical. It was the rot that spread under the bright banners of conquest. Then you bring it to me, Yusuf said, and if I cannot stop it, you will know what kind of rule we truly are. The priest took that in, weighing it like coin. Outside the churchyard, the villagers had gathered again, drawn by the gravity of negotiation. Their faces were tense, waiting for the shape of tomorrow. The priest stepped toward them and lifted his hands, not in blessing, but in the posture of someone calling for attention. He spoke to them in their tongue, measured, careful. Yusuf caught only fragments, enough to hear that he was not inflaming them, enough to hear he was buying time. Yusuf felt something close to relief, and then the rider behind him spoke again, impatient. Lord, the rider said, Cordoba will not like delay. Yusuf turned. Cordoba likes revenue, he replied. It will get it. He made a decision then. Not heroic, not clean. The kind of decision administrators make. A compromise that would satisfy no one completely and might still save lives. He would raise the levy, but not everywhere. Not at once. He would target the larger estates first, the ones whose owners had once served Gothic lords, the ones with storehouses and surplus. He would spare the poorest villages for a season, and he would write it as adjustment rather than mercy. And he would do something else, something that felt like stepping onto thin ice. He would send a letter to the governor, arguing that a predictable tax base was better than short-term extraction, that treaties were tools of rule, that breaking them would cost more than it gained. He knew what that risked. In a world where commanders measured loyalty by hardness, softness could look like betrayal. The priest finished speaking. The villagers did not cheer. They did not kneel. But they did not riot. They drifted apart slowly, like a storm that had decided to pass elsewhere. The farmer approached Yusuf, holding the treaty paper still, now creased and smudged. He looked at Yusuf as if trying to see whether there was a man inside the office. You will take less from us, he said, not a question. I will take what is owed, Yusuf answered, and I will make sure it is not taken twice. The farmer's eyes searched Yusuf's face. Then he nodded once, a gesture that was not trust, but the decision to wait. As Yusuf mounted his horse, he felt the familiar pull inside him, the desire to be righteous and the need to be effective. Ideology wanted clean lines. Pragmatism lived in mud and ledgers and tired faces. He rode back toward the city with the sky darkening, carrying his ledger, his letter, and the uneasy knowledge that he had just made enemies on both sides. Christians who would never love him, and Muslims who might never love him, and Muslims who might. Decide he was too careful with conquered souls. And in the distance behind him, the church bell rang once, just once, as if to remind the valley that their God still had a voice, even under new rulers. Yusuf listened to that single note fade into night and wondered how long his careful bargains could hold back the blunt truth of conquest. The letter to Cordoba took 3 days to compose and less than an hour to regret. Yusuf wrote it at night when the courtyard of his house was quiet and the oil lamp burned low enough to remind him of cost. He did not quote scripture. He did not accuse the governor's treasury of greed. He did not speak of mercy. He spoke of stability. He wrote that the Christian majority, still the spine of agricultural production in the valley, could bear predictable taxation, but not sudden extraction. He wrote that the existing treaties, many made in the first years after 7/11, were not weakness, but architecture. He reminded the governor, politely, that Muslim settlement in the region remained thin, that garrisons could not be everywhere, that local church hierarchies functioned as intermediaries, reducing the cost of rule. He did not write the most dangerous truth. That ideology was easier to shout than to administer. When he sealed the letter, he felt as though he had signed his own examination. By the time the messenger departed, Yusuf had already begun implementing his compromise. Larger estates, particularly those once tied to Visigothic nobles, received notices of reassessment. The smallholders were told their rate would remain unchanged for the year. The effect was immediate and uneven. In one manor near the river, a Christian landholder named Luvigild, who still styled himself with the remnants of aristocratic pride, refused the reassessment outright. He received Yusuf seated in a hall whose mosaics had begun to crumble at the edges, relics of an older confidence. "You raise my levy," Luvigild said, fingers drumming on a carved armrest. "Yet you leave the peasants alone. You claim justice, but this is politics." Yusuf met his gaze. "It is arithmetic." Luvigild's smile was thin. "You fear their rebellion more than mine." "I fear collapse," Yusuf replied. He had learned something from the priest. Habit governs more quietly than force. If peasants felt spared, they would comply. If aristocrats felt singled out, they might protest. But they had more to lose. Luvigild leaned back. "Under the Goths," he said, "I paid because I was bound to the king by blood and oath. Under you, I pay because you hold swords." Yusuf did not deny it. "And because you wish your estate to continue existing." The aristocrat's eyes flicked toward the courtyard, where Muslim soldiers waited. "You are not wrong," he said. In that exchange, Yusuf felt the peculiar clarity of administration. Ideology receded. It was no longer Muslim versus Christian, but surplus versus deficit, power versus survival. Yet the ideological pressure did not disappear. It gathered elsewhere. In Cordoba, whispers began to circle that some administrators were too lenient. Arab commanders, especially those who had come from Syria with expectations of reward, measured success in immediate gain. Berber contingents, resentful of Arab dominance and undercompensated in their view, were quick to interpret any delay in payment as favoritism. Yusuf began receiving reports of tensions not in villages, but within the ruling community itself. One afternoon, he was summoned to the residence of an Arab commander named Khalid ibn Marwan, a man whose armor gleamed more brightly than his patience. "You are cautious," Khalid said without greeting. "The men say you move like a scribe, not a conqueror." "I am a scribe," Yusuf answered. "You are more than that. You are entrusted with the revenue that keeps the army loyal." There it was. Loyalty. Khalid paced the room. "The Christians are still the majority," he said. "They farm. They trade. They worship in their churches as if nothing has changed. Do you not see the danger?" Yusuf chose his words carefully. "They worship because their treaties permit it. They farm because we need them to. They pay because we enforce it." Khalid stopped. "You speak as if their churches are allies." "They are instruments," Yusuf said quietly. Khalid's expression hardened. "Be careful that your instruments do not become masters." Yusuf understood the underlying fear. The church was more than ritual. It was administration. Bishops corresponded across regions. Clerics kept records. They provided continuity between the Visigothic past and the present. If left too autonomous, they might foster resistance. Not armed revolt, but something subtler. Refusal, delay, solidarity. Yet, dismantling that structure would demand resources the Muslim minority did not possess. "The empire," Yusuf said slowly, "is not yet strong enough to replace what exists." Khalid's lip curled. "Then it must become stronger." "Strength requires time," Yusuf replied. And coin. That silenced the commander for a moment. Coin was the language both understood. Outside the residence, Yusuf noticed a cluster of Berber soldiers arguing with Arab troops near the stables. The words were sharp, the grievances old. Berbers complained of unequal distribution of spoil. Arabs complained of Berber insubordination. Yusuf felt the ground shifting beneath him. Conquest had been achieved by a coalition. Arab leadership, Berber manpower. Now, in peacetime, the hierarchy reasserted itself. Arabs dominated the highest offices. Berbers were often stationed in harsher frontier zones. Resentment fermented, and in that ferment, Christian communities watched. Yusuf realized something chilling. If the ruling minority fractured, the majority would not need to rebel. They would simply endure until their rulers exhausted one another. That night, he visited the city's Christian bishop. It was not customary for Muslim administrators to seek counsel from Christian clergy beyond fiscal matters. But Yusuf needed to understand the mood among the majority. The bishop received him in a modest hall lined with manuscripts. He was younger than the valley priest, his demeanor cautious but not hostile. "You are troubled," the bishop observed. Yusuf did not deny it. "Are your people restless?" The bishop folded his hands. "They are cautious. They remember kings who promised stability and delivered chaos. They will pay what is required if it is predictable. They will endure humiliation if it is measured. What they fear is arbitrariness." Yusuf absorbed the word. Arbitrariness was the enemy of empire. "Do they dream of restoration?" Yusuf asked. The bishop smiled faintly. "Every conquered people dreams, but dreams do not harvest grain." Yusuf almost laughed. "And your clergy?" he pressed. "Do they preach resistance?" "They preach survival," the bishop said, "and repentance." Yusuf left the hall with a strange mixture of reassurance and dread. The Christian majority was not preparing open revolt. They were calculating, adapting, surviving. And within the Muslim ranks, impatience was growing. The governor's reply arrived 2 weeks later. It was brief. "Revenue must increase. Delays are tolerable only if compensated. You are to ensure compliance without provoking unrest. No praise, no rebuke." A demand wrapped in pragmatism. Yusuf read the letter twice. Ensure compliance without provoking unrest. That was the whole dilemma reduced to a sentence. He felt, for the first time, the interior crack widening. He believed in the supremacy of Islam. He believed conquest was not an accident, but destiny. Yet his daily work required him to protect Christian institutions so they could continue functioning, so the empire could function. He was, in effect, preserving the church so the state could tax it. He walked through Cordoba's streets at dusk, past mosques still modest in size, past churches still crowded, past markets where Arabic mingled with Latin. Cultural coexistence was not a philosophy. It was noise and trade and shared wells. Muslim and Christian craftsmen sold to one another. Christian scribes sometimes translated documents for Muslim officials. Muslim merchants relied on Christian networks that stretched into older Iberian routes. Empire was practical before it was ideological, but ideology waited. Yusuf stopped at the edge of the river and watched its dark surface move under the last light. He had chosen compromise. He had defended treaties. He had argued for predictability. Now he had to prove that pragmatism could sustain power without hollowing faith. Behind him, a muezzin called the faithful to prayer. Across the city, a church bell answered. Two sounds, rising into the same sky. Yusuf closed his eyes and felt the weight of governing between them. The fracture did not begin with Christians. It began with a quarrel over horses. In the courtyard outside Cordoba's administrative hall, Berber cavalrymen demanded arrears they believed were owed to them from earlier campaigns. Arab officers responded with cold hierarchy. Voices rose. Hands moved toward sword hilts. The quarrel was not about animals. It was about dignity. Yusuf stood at the edge of the commotion and understood with sick clarity that the Christians were not the immediate danger. It was the conquerors themselves. The Arab commanders had arrived with pedigree, lineage, tribal prestige, proximity to Damascus. The Berbers had supplied the numbers that made conquest possible. Now the spoils were divided unevenly. Settlement lands near fertile valleys often went to Arab elites. Berber contingents were assigned to harsher frontiers, exposed to raiding and scarcity. Resentment fermented in garrisons before it ever reached churches. When the shouting subsided, temporarily, Khalid ibn Marwan summoned Yusuf again. The treasury is strained, Khalid said bluntly. The men must be satisfied. They are paid, Yusuf replied. Paid less than they expect, less than they believe they deserve. Yusuf felt the truth in that. Expectations were not managed by ledgers. And what would you have me do? Yusuf asked. Accelerate collection, Khalid said. Do not stagger it. Raise the levy everywhere. Now, no, there it was again. Simplicity, force. Yusuf thought of the valley priest, of the farmer, of the bishop's measured warning about arbitrariness. If he complied fully, unrest would follow, not necessarily rebellion, but the slow erosion of compliance. Hidden harvest, evasive bookkeeping, clergy, quietly advising caution, villagers paying late, paying short. If he refused, he risked being labeled weak, or worse, sympathetic to unbelievers. Commander, Yusuf said carefully, if we extract too quickly, we risk flight. Flight to where? Khalid snapped. The mountains. Let them starve. Starving peasants produce no grain, Yusuf said evenly. And bandits in mountains raid caravans. Khalid's gaze sharpened. You argue like a merchant. I argue like a steward, Yusuf replied. The word hung between them. Stewardship implied guardianship, not ownership. It implied responsibility beyond conquest. Khalid leaned forward. Be careful, Yusuf. The men do not conquer to become stewards of churches. There it was, the ideological edge. Conquest had a narrative. Islam triumphant. The old order humbled. If Christians continued ringing bells, administering their own courts, and occupying visible space, some Muslim soldiers felt cheated of visible supremacy. Yet, visible supremacy did not fill storehouses. Yusuf left the meeting with a compromise already forming, one that would satisfy neither purity nor appetite. He would accelerate collection in urban centers, where Christian merchant elites had greater liquidity and were accustomed to taxation under Visigothic and even Roman systems. In rural areas, he would maintain his staggered schedule but increase oversight to ensure compliance. It was a balancing act built on fragile trust. That evening, he convened Christian and Muslim notables in a shared hall. Neutral ground, chosen deliberately. The bishop came. So did Louvigild. Khalid sent an officer as observer. Yusuf spoke plainly. The treasury requires increased revenue. It will be collected, but collection will be orderly. Urban levies will rise first. Rural schedules will be reviewed at season's end. Louvigild frowned. So the cities bleed before the villages. The cities have coin, Yusuf said. Villages have grain. Coin moves faster. The bishop watched Yusuf with quiet scrutiny. And church properties? Unchanged, Yusuf replied. As long as obligations are met. The Arab observer shifted, but said nothing. The conversation that followed was tense, but contained. Complaints were voiced. Calculations discussed. Clerics asked about exemptions for widows and the infirm. Yusuf granted small adjustments, symbolic concessions that cost little, but signaled restraint. When the meeting ended, the bishop lingered. You walk a narrow road, he said softly. Yusuf allowed himself a thin smile. All roads are narrow when watched from both sides. Your own men distrust you, the bishop observed. They distrust delay, Yusuf corrected. Delay feels like weakness. And what does your heart say? Yusuf hesitated. The question was intimate, almost dangerous. My heart says an empire that cannot govern its majority will not endure. The bishop inclined his head. Then perhaps your heart understands power better than your generals. That night, reports reached Yusuf of unrest, not in Christian quarters, but among Berber garrisons stationed near the northern frontier. Some units had refused to patrol, claiming unequal distribution of spoils and taxation burdens. Yusuf understood the implications immediately. If Berber forces destabilize frontier zones, Christian communities might become exposed to raids or retaliatory violence. And if Christian populations perceived Muslim rule as fracturing, their compliance might weaken. Empire was not a single tension. It was layered. He requested audience with the governor himself. The governor, al-Malik, was a measured man, less impulsive than Khalid, more attentive to long-term stability. You advocate moderation, al-Malik said after hearing Yusuf's summary. Yet, the men are restless. Moderation is not softness, Yusuf replied. It is preservation. Preservation of what? Revenue, order, authority. The governor tapped his fingers against the armrest. And the Christians? They remain subject, Yusuf said. But they remain functional. al-Malik's gaze sharpened. Do you believe coexistence strengthens us? Yusuf chose his answer with care. I believe coexistence is cheaper than domination. Silence filled the chamber. The governor leaned back slowly. You understand that some in the ruling circle believe we must encourage conversion more aggressively. Yusuf nodded. Conversion would shift tax categories. Muslim converts were exempt from certain levies that non-Muslims paid. Encouraging conversion could shrink the tax base, if not managed carefully. If conversion is sincere, Yusuf said, it will come with time. If forced by economic pressure alone, it will hollow both faith and treasury. al-Malik studied him for a long moment. You are pragmatic, the governor said finally. Yes, Yusuf answered, and perhaps necessary. It was not praise, but it was survival. As Yusuf left the palace, he felt the weight of a fragile endorsement. The governor had not repudiated him. That alone bought time. Yet outside the palace walls, tensions simmered. Berber discontent deepened. Arab officers muttered about dilution of authority. Christian clergy watched carefully, weighing whether Muslim divisions signaled opportunity or danger. In the marketplace the next morning, Yusuf heard a Christian merchant say quietly to another, they argue among themselves. We must endure. Endure. It was the word that defined the majority. Yusuf realized that his policies did not win loyalty. They bought endurance. And endurance, in an empire still young and thin, was victory enough. But he also sensed something else rising beneath the surface. The longer Muslim rule stabilized Christian institutions, the more those institutions adapted. Clergy learned Arabic phrases to negotiate better. Christian scribes studied Muslim tax structures. Some merchants began dressing in hybrid styles, speaking both tongues in a single transaction. Cultural coexistence was not static. It was fluid. It reshaped both sides. Yusuf stood in the market and watched a Christian child trade figs with a Muslim soldier, laughing in a mixture of languages neither fully owned. Empire, he thought again, is practical before it is ideological. But practice changes belief. And he wondered, quietly, uneasily, what al-Andalus would look like in a generation. The first Christian to ask Yusuf about conversion did not come trembling. He came calculating. His name was Marius, a merchant of dyed wool in Cordoba's southern quarter. He had paid the urban increase without protest. He had adjusted his prices. He had even offered to supply cloth to Muslim cavalry units at favorable rates. Now he stood before Yusuf in the administrative hall, posture straight, expression neutral. I wish to enter Islam, he said. The words did not surprise Yusuf. They had been coming more frequently in recent months. But the tone did. There was no ecstasy, no visible trembling of conscience, only arithmetic. Yusuf studied him. Why? Marius did not pretend piety. I trade across districts. Muslim merchants pay differently. Their legal standing is simpler in certain courts. Their obligations differ. There it was. Conversion, when it came, was not always a matter of theology. It was often a matter of paperwork. Yusuf felt the quiet alarm rise in him. If large numbers of Christians converted quickly, especially urban taxpayers, the fiscal balance would shift. Toll tax levied on non-Muslims was a significant stream of revenue. Converts no longer paid it. The treasury relied on that distinction. Empire, he thought, is practical before it is ideological. Encourage conversion too aggressively, and you starve the state. Discourage it, and you risk appearing faithless. Yusuf spoke carefully. You understand that faith is not a cloak one wears for convenience. Marius's gaze did not waver. I understand faith is costly in many directions. Yusuf almost admired him. The Christian bishop had warned him months earlier that economic pressure would reshape belief. Not necessarily create sincerity, but create incentives. You will study, Yusuf said. You will learn the words and their meaning, and I will observe. It was a delaying tactic, but also genuine. Converts needed instruction. Sincerity was impossible to measure, but ignorance could be. When Marius left, Yusuf sat back and felt the tightening circle around him. Arab commanders wanted stronger Islamic visibility. Berber units wanted better compensation. Christian elites wanted predictability. Merchants wanted advantage. The governor wanted revenue. and now the boundary between communities was blurring in ways that complicated everything. He visited the bishop that evening. "You have heard," the bishop said, before Yusuf even spoke. "Marius," Yusuf replied. The bishop's mouth thinned. "He is practical. He is not alone," Yusuf said. Silence stretched between them. "Do you oppose it?" Yusuf asked. "I cannot forbid conscience," the bishop answered, "but I know pressure when I see it." "Pressure exists," Yusuf admitted, "but not from me." The bishop's eyes searched his face. "From the system." Yusuf did not deny it. Under Muslim rule, Christians retained autonomy, but they were marked legally as subject. They paid differently. They navigated different courts. Their public religious expression was tolerated but subtly bounded. For some, that boundary was tolerable. For others, it became a lever. "You must understand," Yusuf said quietly, "that if too many convert too quickly, the treasury will adjust elsewhere." The bishop nodded slowly. "On whom?" "On those who remain." The bishop exhaled. There it was, the hidden cruelty of structural pressure. If wealthy Christians converted, the burden shifted downward onto poorer communities, less able to maneuver. "Then you have built a trap," the bishop said. "No," Yusuf said. "I inherited one." He walked back through Cordoba's streets, noticing small changes he had once ignored. Arabic phrases slipping into Christian speech. Christian craftsmen learning Muslim decorative patterns. Muslim soldiers purchasing goods from Christian vendors who now greeted them with practiced fluency. Cultural coexistence was no longer merely endurance. It was adaptation. Yet, adaptation created new resentments. The next week, a group of Arab officers petitioned the governor. They complained that recent converts were insincere, seeking tax advantage rather than submission to God. "Test them," one officer demanded. "Probe their knowledge. Make conversion difficult." Yusuf was present when the complaint was aired. "If we make conversion difficult," he said evenly, "we discourage genuine seekers. And if we make it easy?" the officer countered. "We destabilize revenue," Yusuf replied. The governor watched the exchange with interest. "You argue as if faith and finance are equal," the officer accused. "They intersect," Yusuf said. The room grew tense. At last, the governor spoke. "Conversion shall be accepted," he declared, "but instruction will precede recognition, and fiscal records shall be reviewed carefully." It was another compromise. Afterward, Khalid pulled Yusuf aside. "You walk too close to Christians," he muttered. "I walk close to numbers," Yusuf replied. Khalid's eyes flashed. "Do not forget who conquered this land." "I have not forgotten," Yusuf said quietly. "But conquest is the beginning, not the end." That night, unrest flared in a small town north of the valley. A Berber garrison, unpaid in part due to delayed transfers from Cordoba, requisitioned grain from Christian farmers beyond what was scheduled. The farmers resisted. A scuffle became a beating. A priest was injured intervening. The news reached Yusuf at dawn. He rode north immediately, heart pounding, not from fear of Christian rebellion, but from fear of cascading mistrust. When he arrived, the scene was tense, but not explosive. The priest lay bruised but conscious. The Berber commander looked defensive, not defiant. "We were owed," the commander insisted. "The treasury delays. We eat, and so you break order?" Yusuf asked sharply. The commander shrugged. "Order does not fill stomachs." Yusuf looked at the gathered villagers. Fear had sharpened their faces. Endurance had limits. He ordered compensation for the injured priest, paid from emergency funds allocated to the garrison itself. The Berber commander bristled. "You punish us?" "I preserve you," Yusuf said coldly. "If these villages collapse, your supply lines collapse." He turned to the priest. "You will receive restitution," he said formally, "and your church remains under protection." The priest's eyes searched him, not trusting, but measuring. As Yusuf rode back toward Cordoba, dust rising behind him, he felt the tension solidifying into something heavier. Pragmatism had preserved stability so far, but pressures were multiplying. Conversion shifting revenue, ethnic fractures straining loyalty, soldiers testing limits, Christian institutions adapting to new realities without disappearing. Empire, he thought, is practical before it is ideological, but ideology was growing restless, and he sensed that soon someone would demand a demonstration, not of prudence, but of dominance. He did not yet know whether he would yield. The demonstration came in spring. It was not ordered from Cordoba. It was not even planned. It began with a rumor that a Christian monastery in the hills west of the valley had sheltered a fugitive, an Arab soldier accused of desertion and theft. The rumor was thin, the evidence thinner, but it traveled quickly, because it carried something more powerful than proof: opportunity. For weeks, certain voices among the Arab officers had been muttering that Christian institutions had grown too comfortable, that autonomy had become arrogance, that bells rang too freely. The monastery, small, stone, isolated, was an easy target. By the time Yusuf received word that a detachment of soldiers was marching toward it to investigate, it was already too late to prevent their arrival. He rode hard. The road wound upward through scrub and scattered olive groves. The monastery appeared as a low cluster of buildings around a courtyard cross, smoke rising peacefully from its kitchen hearth. When Yusuf arrived, the soldiers were already assembled in front of its gate. The commander, a young Arab officer eager for notice, saluted briefly. "We search for a deserter," he said. "The monks refuse entry." Yusuf dismounted slowly. "Do you have proof he is here?" he asked. The officer shrugged. "It is said." "By whom?" "A villager." Yusuf looked at the monastery gate, closed, but not barred. Behind it he could see two monks standing rigid, hands folded into sleeves. He felt the weight of the moment immediately. If the soldiers forced entry and found nothing, the humiliation would echo. If they found something, even a minor irregularity, it would become justification for tightening restrictions. He turned to the officer. "You will wait." The officer stiffened. "We cannot appear weak. We cannot appear lawless," Yusuf replied evenly. He approached the gate alone. The prior, an elderly monk with a weathered face, opened it cautiously. "We harbor no soldier," the prior said before Yusuf could speak. "I intend to confirm that peacefully," Yusuf said. The prior studied him, eyes wary, but not hostile. "You have been fair," the monk said quietly, "but your men are restless." "I know," Yusuf replied. Inside, the monastery was simple: cells, chapel, storerooms. Yusuf walked through each space deliberately, accompanied only by the prior. There was no deserter. There were no hidden weapons. Only manuscripts, bread loaves cooling, and a faint smell of incense. When Yusuf returned to the courtyard, the officer was impatient. "Well?" he demanded. "There is no fugitive," Yusuf said clearly. The officer's jaw tightened. The gathered soldiers shifted. "We must make an example," the officer insisted. "They defied entry." Yusuf felt the air thin. "They requested lawful authority," he corrected. "That is not defiance." The officer's eyes flashed. "You protect them." "I protect order," Yusuf said. The standoff held for a long, brittle moment. Then Yusuf made a decision that would ripple outward. He ordered the detachment to stand down, and he imposed a fine, not on the monastery, but on the officer, for conducting an unsanctioned action without formal warrant. The soldiers murmured in shock. The officer flushed red. "You humiliate me before monks." "I discipline you before chaos," Yusuf said coldly. The ride back to Cordoba was silent and tense. Word spread quickly. Among Christian communities, Yusuf's intervention became a quiet reassurance. Not loyalty, but relief. Among certain Arab circles, it became evidence of dangerous softness. Within days, Khalid confronted him. "You punish Muslim officers to protect Christian monks." Khalid's voice was sharp with disbelief. "I punish recklessness," Yusuf replied. "They refuse entry to soldiers of Islam. They requested proper authority." Khalid's expression hardened. "And who grants that authority?" "The administration," Yusuf said calmly. "And you are the administration," Khalid snapped. Yusuf met his gaze. "Yes." The room crackled. "This land was conquered in the name of God," Khalid said. "Yet you behave as if you are steward of a treaty." "I am," Yusuf answered. Khalid stared at him as if seeing him for the first time, not as a subordinate, but as a rival philosophy. "You forget," Khalid said slowly, "that dominance must be visible." Yusuf felt the tension coil tighter inside him. "And you forget," he replied, "that dominance that destroys revenue destroys itself." The governor summoned them both the next morning. al-Malik listened without interruption, as Khalid described the monastery incident in tones of outrage. When Khalid finished, the governor turned to Yusuf. "You fined an officer?" "Yes." "For protecting Christian monks?" "For violating procedure." The governor leaned back. "And what did this achieve?" "Stability," Yusuf said simply. Silence filled the chamber. al-Malik finally spoke. You were correct to avoid violence, he said. But you must be cautious not to erode the confidence of the army. There it was again. Balance. Debt. Then strengthen the treasury, Yusuf replied quietly. And pay them. The governor's mouth twitched faintly. Almost amusement. You argue relentlessly. I argue for survival. After the audience, Yusuf walked alone along the city walls. He knew he had crossed a threshold. He had publicly sided with procedural law over military pride, with treaty over impulse, with Christian institutional continuity over symbolic dominance. He had preserved order, but he had also made enemies. Below the walls he could see Christians moving through markets, Muslim soldiers drilling in courtyards, Berber units sharpening blades in shade. The city functioned. The bells still rang. The muezzin still called. But beneath it all, pressure built. Empire was practical before it was ideological. Yet, ideology, denied spectacle, grows impatient. Yusuf sensed that the next confrontation would not be about monasteries or levies. It would be about identity itself. And in that struggle, compromise would be harder to justify. He stood on the wall until sunset, watching the Guadalquivir catch the last light. For the first time since arriving in al-Andalus, he wondered whether prudence could outlast pride. Identity did not announce itself with banners. It crept. It crept in language first. Yusuf began noticing it in petitions submitted to his office. Christian clerics now wrote portions in Arabic alongside Latin, as if anticipating which script would carry more weight. Muslim scribes occasionally referenced older Visigothic land boundaries, because those were still the most precise records available. Two worlds were not colliding. They were interlocking. And interlocking systems create tension when one part shifts. The Governor's Council convened in early summer to discuss a proposal circulating among several Arab notables. Public restrictions on Christian display. Nothing drastic, no closures, no confiscations, but subtle curbs, fewer visible processions, no construction of new churches without explicit authorization, limits on bell volume during Muslim prayer hours. Symbolic dominance. Khalid spoke first. We have been patient, he said. Too patient. The Christians must be reminded they are subject. Yusuf listened without interruption. Another official added, it is not enough that they pay. They must feel their status. The room hummed with agreement. When Yusuf's turn came, he did not oppose the premise outright. He understood the psychological need behind it. Rulers need affirmation. Armies need visible hierarchy. But he also understood something the others did not articulate. Reminder, he said slowly, is different from humiliation. Khalid snorted softly. If we impose restrictions abruptly, Yusuf continued, we risk reinforcing division. If we enforce existing agreements clearly, we reinforce authority without escalation. And what do existing agreements allow? The governor asked. Yusuf had memorized their contours. Churches may remain. Repairs permitted. New construction subject to review. Public expressions tolerated within customary bounds. Customary bounds, Khalid repeated. And who defines those? The administration, Yusuf replied. The governor leaned back, considering. You propose what? He asked. A formal review of municipal practices, Yusuf said. Clarify expectations. Communicate them to Christian leadership directly. Avoid spontaneous enforcement by officers seeking spectacle. Khalid's expression hardened. You always favor communication. I favor predictability. The governor held up a hand before Khalid could respond. Proceed with the review, he decided. But understand, there must be visible acknowledgement of Muslim primacy. It was a compromise tilted slightly toward ideology. Yusuf left the council chamber feeling the narrowing path beneath his feet. That week, he met again with the bishop. This is inevitable, the bishop said after hearing of the review. Every empire eventually asserts itself symbolically. Yusuf nodded. Better symbol than sword. Perhaps, the bishop replied, but symbols linger longer. They spoke frankly. Christian communities had adapted under Muslim rule. Clergy adjusted sermons to emphasize patience and civic peace. Merchants cultivated relationships across religious lines. Some Christian families even sent sons to learn Arabic literacy for commercial advantage. Yet, beneath adaptation was anxiety. If bells are restricted, the bishop said, people will feel silenced. If processions are curtailed, Yusuf answered, Muslim crowds will feel affirmed. And what do you feel? The bishop asked quietly. Yusuf hesitated. I feel, he said at last, that identity is becoming currency. The bishop gave a small, weary smile. It always was. The municipal review began without fanfare. Yusuf dispatched notices clarifying prayer times, public conduct, and construction protocols. He framed them not as new restrictions, but as reaffirmation of treaty boundaries. In some towns, compliance was smooth. In others, small frictions flared. A church in the western quarter rang its bell slightly longer than usual one evening. A Muslim youth complained loudly in the market. Words were exchanged, nothing violent, but charged. Yusuf intervened personally, instructing the priest to moderate duration during Friday prayer hours. He did so publicly but respectfully. Balance, debt. Yet the ideological faction was not satisfied. Khalid approached him one evening with something more dangerous than complaint. Several officers, Khalid said, believe the time has come to encourage visible conversion. Yusuf's stomach tightened. How? He asked. Privileges for converts, Khalid said. Public recognition. Positions in local administration. Yusuf recognized the trap. Promote converts publicly, and Christian communities might fracture internally. Clergy could perceive betrayal. Converts might be viewed as opportunists. Yet denying converts advancement risked alienating new Muslims. You propose rewarding faith, Yusuf said carefully. I propose accelerating transformation, Khalid replied. Transformation. The word felt heavy. Empire, Yusuf thought, is practical before it is ideological. But ideology dreams of transformation. He sought audience with the governor once more. al-Malik listened in silence. If we elevate converts too quickly, Yusuf argued, we destabilize both communities. Christians will feel coerced. Arab elitists will resent newcomers. Berber units may interpret favoritism as further marginalization. The governor considered this. And if we do nothing? He asked. Then conversion proceeds organically, Yusuf replied. Slower. Less disruptive. al-Malik's eyes narrowed slightly. You speak as if patience is infinite. It is not, Yusuf admitted, but it is cheaper than conflict. The governor rose and walked toward the window, overlooking Cordoba. You are aware, he said quietly, that some in Damascus expect visible Islamization of new territories. There it was, the distant center of ideological gravity. We are not Damascus, Yusuf answered. We are al-Andalus. The governor turned slowly. And what is al-Andalus? Yusuf did not hesitate. A land where the majority is Christian, the rulers are Muslim, and both must survive each other. Silence hung in the chamber. Finally, al-Malik spoke. Continue as you have. For now. For now. As Yusuf left, he felt no triumph, only reprieve. In the streets that evening, he saw a small but telling sight. A Christian artisan carving geometric patterns into a wooden door. Patterns borrowed from Islamic design, but executed with local hands. Hybrid, thought, not surrender, not domination, something in between. Yusuf understood then that coexistence was not static tolerance. It was gradual entanglement, but entanglement also threatened clarity. The ideological faction wanted clarity, Muslim dominance, visible, Christian subordination, unmistakable. Pragmatism wanted blur. Blur preserved revenue. Blur avoided uprising. Blur allowed gradual shifts without rupture. He stood again by the river at dusk, listening to the muezzin's call rise, and, moments later, the softer toll of a bell. Two sounds, one city. He wondered which would outlast the other, or whether in time they would change so much that neither would recognize its own beginning. The first public convert to receive visible recognition was not Marius. It was a young man named Julian, once a minor clerk in a Christian household, now eager, fluent in Arabic, and ambitious. The governor, pressured by voices from above and within, authorized a symbolic appointment. Julian would assist in municipal record-keeping under Muslim supervision. A small gesture, a careful one, but visible. The ceremony was simple. No grand proclamation, no parade, just acknowledgement in the administrative courtyard. Yusuf stood nearby as Julian recited the Shahada in measured tones, his voice steady. Some Muslims nodded approvingly. Some Arabs watched with narrowed eyes. Across the square, Christian onlookers stood silent. Yusuf felt the layered consequence ripple outward immediately. To Khalid, it was a step toward transformation. To Christian clergy, it was a fracture line. To Yusuf, it was a calculation in motion. Afterward he spoke privately with Julian. "You understand," Yusuf said, "that you will be watched by both sides." Julian smiled faintly. "I have been watched all my life." "Conversion is not merely advantage," Yusuf warned. "It is also survival," Julian replied. The word echoed. Survival had driven Christian endurance. Now it drove some toward Islam. Yusuf could not condemn it, but he could see its destabilizing potential. Within days, Christian whispers circulated. Some accused Julian of betrayal. Others quietly inquired about the process of conversion. The bishop requested a meeting. He was restless, the bishop said calmly. "Now he is repositioned." "You do not mourn him?" Yusuf asked. "I mourn division," the bishop answered. Yusuf nodded. "Division weakens communities, or reshapes them," the bishop corrected. Outside Cordoba, Berber unrest simmered again. Reports reached Yusuf of units refusing reassignment orders, citing unequal treatment compared to Arab officers. This time, the tension carried sharper edges. Berber leaders began invoking their role in the original conquest, reminding Arab commanders that without Berber numbers, al-Andalus would not exist under Muslim rule at all. Yusuf recognized the danger immediately. If Arab-Berber conflict escalated into open confrontation, Christian communities might exploit the fracture or suffer collateral damage. The governor convened emergency council. Voices rose quickly. "Berber insubordination cannot be tolerated," Khalid insisted. "They demand equity," another official countered. Yusuf listened carefully before speaking. "Equity requires resources," he said. "Resources require revenue. And revenue requires pressure," Khalid shot back. "Pressure without structure invites collapse," Yusuf replied. The governor silenced them with a raised hand. "What do you propose?" al-Malik asked Yusuf. "A redistribution review," Yusuf said. "Clarify land assignments, address grievances formally, and ensure pay schedules are met." "And the Christians?" the governor pressed. "They must see order maintained," Yusuf answered. "If the ruling minority fractures visibly, compliance weakens." The governor nodded slowly. "Proceed." Yusuf left the chamber with a grim understanding. He was no longer merely balancing Christian autonomy against Muslim authority. He was balancing Muslim against Muslim. And the Christians watched. In the countryside, coexistence continued in daily rhythms. Markets bustled. Irrigation canals were maintained jointly. Muslim soldiers purchased bread from Christian bakers, who now sprinkled Arabic greetings into their speech. But beneath the surface, identity sharpened. Some Muslim preachers began emphasizing visible distinction. Dress, public conduct, markers of faith. Some Christian clerics responded by reinforcing community boundaries, urging caution in social mingling. Coexistence was no longer merely practical. It was conscious. Yusuf rode through a mixed quarter one evening and saw something that unsettled him deeply. A Christian child wearing a small pendant shaped like a cross played beside a Muslim child practicing Arabic recitation. They laughed together easily, but when their mothers called them home, each returned to separate doors. Two worlds touching, but not merging. Empire, Yusuf thought again, is practical before it is ideological. But ideology grows in the spaces practice cannot erase. That night, Khalid confronted him once more. "You slow transformation," Khalid said bluntly. "I prevent fracture," Yusuf replied. "Fracture purifies," Khalid insisted. "Fracture impoverishes," Yusuf countered. Khalid's eyes burned. "You are too cautious, and you are too impatient." Silence stretched between them. Khalid finally said, "If Damascus demands stronger measures, you will not be able to shield them." Yusuf understood. External pressure was building. Reports sent eastward likely described al-Andalus as administratively stable but culturally ambiguous. Some would interpret that ambiguity as weakness. He walked home under a sky clear and cold. In the distance, he heard both call to prayer and bell. Not simultaneous this time. Separate. The space between them felt larger. Yusuf realized that the tension he had managed through policy was evolving into something less tangible. Belonging. Who belonged at the center of al-Andalus? Who was tolerated at its edges? And could a system built on pragmatic coexistence withstand the pull of ideological clarity? As he entered his courtyard, he felt the weight of years settling on him. He had preserved stability. He had prevented violence. He had defended treaty and procedure. But he sensed that soon, circumstances would demand a decision not about tax, or bell, or conversion. It would demand a decision about priority. Faith first, or function. He was not certain which would prevail. The decision came disguised as mercy. A drought. It began quietly. The winter rains came late and light. The Guadalquivir receded earlier than expected. Irrigation channels thinned to threads. Olive yields diminished. Grain heads formed smaller, brittle. At first, no one panicked. Iberia had known dry years before. But by midsummer, it was clear. Revenue would fall. Yusuf rode through parched fields and understood that no ideology survives an empty granary. Christian farmers looked at him differently now, not resentful, not calculating, simply tired. In the city, Muslim garrisons complained of reduced provisions. Berber units in frontier districts sent terse messages about supply shortages. The treasury figures reached Yusuf's desk in hard ink. Urban levies down. Rural grain deliveries reduced. Emergency reserves thinning. The governor summoned him. "We must compensate," al-Malik said bluntly. "The army cannot starve." Yusuf nodded slowly. Options presented themselves like blades. Increase tax during famine. Risk revolt. Reduce military pay. Risk insubordination. Borrow against future revenue. Risk instability. Or temporarily suspend certain Christian exemptions and requisition church stores. It was Khalid who voiced it aloud. "The monasteries have reserves," he said. "They collect, they store, they can contribute." The room fell silent. Yusuf felt the heat rise in his chest. Churches had maintained granaries for widows, for the poor, for communal relief. Those stores were not vast, but visible. If the state requisitioned them, it would signal unmistakable dominance. It would also rupture the trust he had cultivated. "Those stores sustain the vulnerable," Yusuf said evenly. "They sustain loyalty to priests," Khalid replied. "And loyalty to priests sustains order," Yusuf answered. Khalid's eyes flashed. "Order does not fill bellies." "No," Yusuf said quietly. "Grain does." The governor watched them carefully. "What do you propose?" al-Malik asked. Yusuf took a breath. "Temporary redistribution," he said. "State granaries to supplement villages first. In exchange, Christian leadership formally acknowledges the state's relief role. Shared responsibility." Khalid scoffed. "You want their gratitude." "I want their cooperation," Yusuf replied. The governor considered. "And if stores run out?" "Then we negotiate further," Yusuf said. "Negotiate." No. The word tasted bitter, even to him. The bishop received Yusuf with solemn understanding. "We feared this," the bishop admitted. "As did I," Yusuf said. They walked through the church's small storehouse together. Sacks, stacked carefully. Not abundant, but meaningful. "I will not seize these," Yusuf said quietly. "But I will ask." "For what?" the bishop asked. "Contribution to communal relief. In return, public recognition that aid flows through both church and state." The bishop studied him. "You wish to share credit. I wish to share burden." Silence stretched between them. "If we agree," the bishop said, "it must not appear that we were compelled." "You will not be," Yusuf replied. It was another compromise, another balancing act. The arrangement was announced carefully. State granaries would distribute grain in affected villages. Churches would open their stores to supplement relief. Public notices emphasized cooperation between Muslim administration and Christian leadership for the welfare of all inhabitants. The reaction was mixed. Some Muslims grumbled that Christian stores were insufficiently tapped. Some Christians feared hidden accounting. But in the villages, grain arrived. Relief mattered more than rhetoric. For a time. Yet, scarcity sharpens suspicion. One evening, Yusuf received alarming news. In a frontier district, a Berber unit, unpaid and undersupplied, had raided a monastery's granary without authorization. The monks resisted. 2 were injured. Yusuf felt the familiar surge of dread. He rode north immediately. The monastery courtyard bore signs of struggle. Spilled grain, broken door hinges. The Berber commander stood defiant. "We were hungry," he said flatly. "And you break order?" Yusuf demanded. Order starves, the commander replied. Yusuf looked at the wounded monks. He looked at the gaunt faces of soldiers. This was the moment. Pragmatism demanded discipline. Ideology demanded assertion. Hunger demanded grain. He made his choice. He ordered restitution from central stores, compensation for the monastery, and disciplinary reassignment for the offending unit. The Berber commander glared. You favor priests over soldiers. I favor survival over collapse, Yusuf said. Word of the decision spread quickly. Among Christians, cautious relief. Among certain Muslim factions, growing resentment. Khalid confronted him openly, in council. You risk alienating the army, Khalid said sharply. I risk losing the countryside, Yusuf replied. And if Damascus hears that Christian institutions are protected, while soldiers are punished? Yusuf met his gaze steadily. Then Damascus must decide whether it wants revenue or spectacle. The governor intervened before the exchange escalated. But Yusuf felt it now. The tension had reached a new stage. It was no longer about balancing identity and function quietly. It was about visible priority. And his priorities were clear. He walked through Cordoba's streets at dusk and saw famine etched into faces, but also relief distribution lines moving in orderly fashion. Children receiving bread, monks assisting Muslim officials in tallying grain, Berber soldiers watching from a distance, their pride wounded but their bellies filled. Empire is practical before it is ideological, but in famine, practicality becomes moral. Yusuf understood that some would interpret his actions as weakness, others as fairness. History would not record the hunger lines. It would record whether al-Andalus endured. As the drought deepened and tensions hardened, Yusuf sensed that the next crisis would not be natural. It would be chosen, and it would test whether his model of coexistence could survive deliberate challenge. The chosen crisis came not from hunger, but from zeal. A preacher arrived from the east. He was not sent officially by Damascus, not endorsed in writing, but he carried letters of introduction from respected circles, and a reputation for uncompromising clarity. His name was Harith ibn Qays, and he spoke with a kind of fire that makes moderation feel like cowardice. He began in the mosque courtyard on a Friday thick with heat. Yusuf attended, as he always did. Harith's voice was not loud, but it cut. God did not grant victory, he said, so that believers might preserve the customs of unbelief. Murmurs of approval. We are entrusted with land, he continued, not merely to tax it, but to purify it. There it was. Purify. Yusuf felt the air tighten around him. Harith did not call for violence. He was too intelligent for that. He called for clarity. For too long, Harith said, we have tolerated ambiguity. Bells ring as if sovereignty were shared. Churches stand as if conquest were incomplete. Converts come for coin rather than conviction. We must demonstrate that Islam reigns. The courtyard hummed. Yusuf understood immediately. Harith gave language to the restlessness that had been building quietly. After the prayer, Khalid sought him out. You hear? Khalid said, satisfaction barely concealed. I hear, Yusuf replied. This is what the men need. And what the treasury needs? Yusuf asked quietly. Khalid did not answer. Within days, Harith's influence spread. Small gatherings formed after prayers. Discussions about visible reform. Demands that Christian public presence be further curtailed. Not violence, yet, but pressure. Yusuf requested audience with Harith. They met in a shaded courtyard near the mosque. You administer al-Andalus, Harith said without preamble. I serve its stability, Yusuf replied. Stability without supremacy is hollow, Harith countered. Yusuf studied him carefully. Harith believed what he said. There was no cynicism in him. Supremacy exists, Yusuf said. We rule. Rule must be felt, Harith insisted. The majority still lives, as if nothing has changed. They pay, Yusuf said. They endure, Harith corrected. Endurance breeds memory. Yusuf felt the truth in that, and the danger. You propose what? Yusuf asked. Limit visible, Christian ritual. Encourage conversion openly. Ensure that Muslim authority is not merely administrative, but moral. Yusuf's chest tightened. Moral authority, he said slowly, cannot be forced. It can be signaled, Harith replied. That word again. Signal. Fire. Yusuf walked back through Cordoba, in a haze of calculation. Harith was not wrong that visible hierarchy shapes perception, but he was blind to fragility. The Christian majority had not rebelled because they had been allowed space to function. Press too hard, and space collapses. That evening, Yusuf met with the governor. al-Malik's face was grave. Harith has influence, the governor said. Ignoring him risks alienating devout factions. Following him risks destabilizing the countryside, Yusuf replied. What do you suggest? The governor asked. Yusuf paused. A measured demonstration, he said. The governor raised an eyebrow. Visible but limited, Yusuf continued. Enforce existing treaty limits publicly. Reaffirm Muslim primacy in ceremony. But avoid new restrictions. Symbol without rupture, the governor murmured. Yes. It was another compromise. A public declaration was arranged for the following Friday. After prayer, the governor addressed the gathered faithful. Al-Andalus stands under Muslim rule, he proclaimed. Treaties remain in force. Christian communities retain their rights under protection. But let there be no doubt. Sovereignty belongs to Islam. It was carefully balanced. Harith nodded, satisfied. For now, Khalid seemed cautiously pleased. Yusuf felt only exhaustion. The declaration was followed by visible enforcement of minor regulations. Bell times clarified. Processions confined to traditional routes. No new church construction permitted without review. Christian leaders complied, reluctantly, but without open protest. Yet, Yusuf sensed a shift. Coexistence was no longer an unspoken rhythm. It had become negotiated theater. One evening, he encountered the bishop walking alone. You walk a dangerous line, the bishop said softly. I always have, Yusuf replied. This preacher, the bishop continued, does not see us as neighbors. He sees you as subjects, Yusuf said. And you? The bishop asked. Yusuf hesitated. I see you as necessary. The bishop smiled faintly. Necessity can become respect, he said. Or resentment. Yusuf watched him walk away, and felt something heavier than fear. Fatigue. Years of balancing had left him frayed. Harith's sermons grew sharper in tone, still not inciting violence, but emphasizing distinction. Young Muslims began correcting Christian neighbors more openly in markets. Small arguments flared over dress, over speech, over minor infractions. Nothing exploded, but tension thickened. Empire, Yusuf thought again, is practical before it is ideological. But ideology, once awakened, does not sleep easily. As he stood in his courtyard that night, listening to the muted sounds of both prayer and bell across the city, he understood that his model of rule, thin, negotiated, balanced, was being tested by a deeper hunger, not for grain, for identity. And identity, unlike tax, cannot be staggered or redistributed. Soon, he sensed, he would be forced to choose not how to balance, but what to protect. The choice came in the form of a crowd. It began with a dispute so small, it should have dissolved by dusk. A Christian artisan, an older man known for carving doors, refused to remove a newly installed cross from above his workshop entrance. It was modest, no larger than a man's hand, but it faced the street. A group of younger Muslims, stirred by Harith's sermons, objected. Private worship is protected, one of them insisted. Public display must not challenge sovereignty. The artisan replied that the cross had always marked his trade. Voices rose. Someone pushed. By the time Yusuf was summoned, the street had filled. Christians clustered near the workshop. Muslims gathered opposite. Berber soldiers stood, uncertain at the edges, not yet intervening. Harith was present. So was Khalid. Yusuf dismounted slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his bones. This was no longer about tax or drought. It was about symbol. Harith spoke first. Remove it, he said calmly to the artisan. You are protected, but not sovereign. The artisan's face was pale, but steady. My father carved here, he said. His cross marked this place. It harms no one. The crowd murmured. Yusuf stepped forward. The treaty permits existing churches and customary markers, he said evenly. It prohibits new public displays intended to assert parity. Harith's eyes narrowed. Is this customary? Harith asked. Yusuf turned to the bishop, who had arrived breathless. It has stood here before? Yusuf asked. The bishop nodded. It has. Yusuf studied the wood. It was worn, edges smoothed by time. This was no sudden provocation. It was continuity. He felt the competing pressures crash together inside him. Remove it, and assert clarity. Satisfy Harith. Affirm Muslim primacy, visibly. Allow it, and preserve custom. Reinforce treaty integrity. Risk appearing soft. The crowd waited. Yusuf understood something then, with painful clarity. He was not choosing between cross and call to prayer. He was choosing whether rule would rest on fear or agreement. He raised his voice. The cross remains, he said. The Muslim youths erupted in protest. Harith's expression hardened. Explain, Harith demanded. It is customary, Yusuf replied steadily. Not new. Treaty permits continuity. Sovereignty is not threatened by memory. Khalid stepped closer. You undermine authority, he hissed. I enforce law, Yusuf answered. The tension sharpened. For a moment, Yusuf feared blades would be drawn. Then he did something deliberate. He ordered a formal inscription to be placed beside the workshop entrance, a small plaque bearing Arabic script, protected under treaty. Sovereignty of Islam, affirmed. The crowd stilled. The cross remained. The inscription asserted hierarchy. It was compromise made visible. Harith regarded him for a long, burning moment. You balance endlessly, Harith said quietly. One day, you will fall. Perhaps, Yusuf replied, but not today. The crowd dispersed slowly. Christians exhaled relief. Muslim youths muttered dissatisfaction. Khalid did not conceal his anger. You protect their symbols, he said later in council. I protect the treaty, Yusuf replied. You dilute dominance. I preserve obedience. The governor intervened once more. The solution was clever, al-Malik admitted. But cleverness breeds enemies. Yusuf knew that already. That night, Harith's sermon sharpened. Compromise, he said from the courtyard. Yusuf stood among the faithful and felt the words strike him personally. Was he doubting? No. He believed in Muslim sovereignty, but he also believed sovereignty did not require erasure. He walked home under a sky heavy with heat. The bishop met him unexpectedly at the gate. You have spared us humiliation, the bishop said. I have postponed escalation, Yusuf replied. That may be the same thing, the bishop said softly. Yusuf did not answer. In the days that followed, he noticed something subtle but profound. Christians carried themselves with slightly more confidence. Not defiance, just steadiness. Muslim youths grew more watchful. Berber soldiers remained distant, their own grievances unresolved. Harith continued preaching, and Yusuf felt the cost accumulating, not in coin, but in loyalty. Among certain Arab factions, his name now carried suspicion. Too accommodating, too administrative, too attached to treaty. He had preserved order, but he had also defined himself. Empire is practical before it is ideological, but ideology measures purity, not outcome. As he reviewed tax ledgers late one night, Yusuf realized that his position depended not on victory, but on trust. Trust from Christians that treaties meant something. Trust from the governor that stability mattered. Trust from Muslim soldiers that their authority was not diminished. Trust from converts that their choice was not exploited. Trust from himself that he was not betraying his own faith. The balancing had become identity. He was no longer merely administrator. He was symbol, and symbols attract judgment. He sensed that soon. Pressure would not come from below, but from above. From Damascus. From those who did not see the olive groves, the drought lines, the market negotiations. Those who saw al-Andalus as conquest complete, not conquest negotiated. Yusuf closed his ledger and looked into the darkness. If a command came demanding unmistakable assertion, no compromise, would he comply? Or would he resist? The question lingered like heat in the air, and he knew the answer would cost him. The command came sealed in green wax. It bore the governor's insignia, but beneath it, in the margin, the notation that mattered, copied to Damascus. Yusuf broke the seal alone. The letter was measured in tone, but unmistakable in intent. Increased demonstration of Islamic authority is expected. Visible markers of Muslim primacy must be clarified across provincial districts. Reports indicate excessive accommodation in certain regions. Excessive accommodation. He read the phrase twice. The governor summoned him before sunset. al-Malik did not sit when Yusuf entered. Damascus has received reports, the governor said quietly. From whom? Yusuf asked. Multiple sources. Khalid's name hung unspoken in the room. The caliph's advisors, the governor continued, expect stronger consolidation. Not chaos, not violence, but unmistakable hierarchy. Yusuf felt the air constrict. And what form does that take? He asked. The governor's gaze did not waver. Reduction of Christian public visibility. Stricter differentiation. Clearer legal demarcation in municipal practice. There it was. Not massacre, not expulsion, but narrowing. Yusuf understood the scale immediately. Restrictions on processions beyond older quarters. Limitations on church repairs without approval delays. Public reaffirmations of subordinate status during major festivals. Small measures. Symbolic measures. But cumulative. And if I refuse? Yusuf asked. The governor's expression did not soften. You will be replaced. The simplicity of it cut clean. Years of balancing, negotiation, restraint, and now the center demanded demonstration. Yusuf walked from the palace into the late heat of Cordoba, his mind racing not with fear, but with arithmetic. If he complied fully, Christian confidence would fracture. If he resisted openly, he would lose his position, and likely his ability to mitigate excess from whoever replaced him. Empire is practical before it is ideological. But when ideology speaks from the center, pragmatism must choose its battlefield. That night, he visited the bishop. The bishop read the letter in silence. So, he said at last, the distance has shortened. Yes. What will you do? Yusuf stared at the parchment. I will enforce, but shape. The bishop watched him carefully. Explain. I will implement differentiation, Yusuf said slowly, but in ways that are administrative, not humiliating. Clarify legal distinctions without theatrical degradation. The bishop exhaled slowly. You believe that will satisfy Damascus? I believe it will satisfy report writers. There it was. Reports were not reality. Reports were narrative. Yusuf drafted his response carefully. He outlined new municipal guidelines. Christian public festivals confined strictly to traditional quarters. Church repairs require documentation and inspection, but not prohibition. Distinctive tax records clearly labeling religious status for administrative clarity. Public affirmation during major Muslim celebrations of Islamic sovereignty, attended by Christian representatives. No new taxes, no confiscations, no forced conversions. Symbol, without rupture. He submitted the plan. The governor approved it with a nod. Be careful, al-Malik said quietly. You walk between scrutiny and suspicion. The implementation began gradually. Some Christian leaders bristled. Some Muslim factions felt vindicated. Harith delivered a sermon, praising renewed clarity. Khalid expressed cautious approval. Yet Yusuf saw what others did not. Christian communities adjusted once more. Processions shortened, but attendance intensified. Church repairs slowed, but communal labor increased. Tax records labeled more clearly, but resentment grew quieter, deeper. Differentiation sharpened identity. Coexistence continued, but more consciously. Yusuf rode through the valley weeks later and felt the subtle shift in atmosphere. Christians bowed slightly lower in public encounters. Muslims walked slightly taller. The balance had tipped, not into violence, but into clarity. And clarity cost. That evening, the farmer from the olive grove approached Yusuf again. You have changed the rules, the farmer said. I have clarified them, Yusuf replied. The farmer studied him. You protect us, he said slowly, but you also remind us. Yes. Remind us of what? Yusuf did not hesitate. That you are subjects. The farmer nodded once. And you? Yusuf paused. I am responsible. The farmer's eyes narrowed slightly. Responsibility is heavy, he said. Yes, Yusuf replied. It was. In Cordoba, Harith's influence stabilized, neither expanding nor shrinking. The governor sent a report eastward, describing strengthened differentiation and reaffirmed sovereignty. Months passed without explosion, but Yusuf knew something fundamental had shifted. He had complied. He had shaped compliance to minimize rupture, but he had accepted that ideological assertion would occasionally override pure pragmatism. The olive groves still produced. Markets still hummed. Bells still rang, softer but present. The muezzin still called. Empire endured. But Yusuf felt older. He had chosen to remain within the machine, to guide it from inside. And that meant accepting that sometimes ideology would be allowed to lead, so long as it did not break the engine. He stood again by the river one night, watching water reflect moonlight. He had not prevented differentiation. He had structured it. Was that compromise or complicity? The question lingered. And he understood now that the final test would not come from crowd or preacher. It would come from succession. From what kind of leadership replaced men like al-Malik? Because empires endure not through one administrator's balance, but through what follows him. Succession did not wait for comfort. Al-Malik fell ill in winter. It was not dramatic. No assassination. No palace coup. Just fever that lingered and lungs that weakened. He continued to receive reports from his bed for weeks. Voice thinning but mind sharp. Yusuf visited him twice during those final days. You have kept balance, the governor said during their last private audience. But balance depends on weight. I know, Yusuf replied. And weight shifts. Yes. Malik's gaze held him steadily. The man likely to succeed me is less patient. Yusuf did not need the name spoken. Khalid. The governor closed his eyes briefly. You must decide whether you will remain, he said softly. Remain. As if leaving were simple. When Malik died, Cordoba shifted. Not violently, not immediately, but perceptibly. Khalid ibn Marwan assumed authority with confidence that bordered on relief. His first address to council was brief and direct. We will not undo stability, he said, but we will strengthen clarity. The phrase echoed. Strengthen clarity. Harith's sermons intensified in approval. Yusuf felt the narrowing space around him. Within weeks, Khalid ordered review of administrative appointments, including Yusuf's. You have served, Khalid said in private, but your methods are cautious. They are effective, Yusuf replied. They are soft, Khalid countered. They preserve revenue. They blur supremacy. Silence stretched between them. You will remain, Khalid said at last. For now. But policy will sharpen. It began subtly. Tax records were revised with stricter categorization. Conversions scrutinized more intensely. Church repair permits delayed longer than before. None of it catastrophic, but cumulative. Yusuf found himself increasingly mediating damage rather than shaping policy. He met with the bishop once more. Your influence wanes, the bishop said plainly. Yes. Will you fight? Yusuf considered the word. Fight. Mimshon. He had never fought with sword. I will manage what I can, he said. The bishop nodded slowly. Then we endure again. Endure. The word returned like an old companion. In rural districts, enforcement became less flexible. One monastery fined heavily for delayed paperwork. A procession halted mid-route for exceeding new boundaries. Muslim youths grew bolder in public correction. Berber grievances remained unresolved, now overshadowed by renewed emphasis on ideological cohesion. And yet, revenue held. Markets functioned. Conversion rates ticked upward, not dramatically, but steadily. The system tightened, but did not snap. Yusuf walked through Cordoba one evening and realized something unsettling. He was no longer the center of balance. He was the margin. Policy moved without his full authorship. He could soften edges, but not redraw lines. Empire is practical before it is ideological. But once ideology consolidates power, practicality becomes servant rather than guide. One afternoon, a Christian delegation arrived unannounced at his office. The farmer from the olive grove stood among them. We have paid, the farmer said quietly. We have complied, but fines multiply. Yusuf examined their petitions. Some were legitimate grievances. Some were technical infractions. All reflected a shift in tone. He intervened where he could, reducing fines, clarifying misunderstandings. But his authority now required Khalid's endorsement more often. And Khalid was watching him. You rescue them too easily, Khalid said one evening. I prevent resentment from fermenting, Yusuf replied. Resentment clarifies allegiance, Khalid said. Yusuf stared at him. Resentment breeds rebellion, he answered. Khalid's expression hardened. Fear prevents rebellion. Yusuf felt the final divergence crystallize. Fear versus function. Dominance versus durability. That night, he returned home later than usual. He sat alone in his courtyard, listening to distant sounds. Muffled bell, distant call to prayer. The balance he had built had not collapsed. It had been absorbed, modified, redirected. Al-Andalus endured, but differently. He understood something then, with a calm that surprised him. His role had always been transitional. The first generation of rule requires negotiation. The second demands consolidation. The third forgets negotiation ever existed. He had served the first. Now the second was underway. The question was not whether he would prevail. It was whether the foundations he had reinforced, treaty, procedure, coexistence, would endure beneath sharper rule. He looked up at the night sky and felt neither triumph nor defeat, only acceptance. Empire is practical before it is ideological, but it becomes ideological to justify its permanence. He rose, knowing that his next decision would not shape al-Andalus. It would shape himself. Yusuf did not resign. He withdrew, not in office. His seal still marked documents, his hand still reviewed ledgers, but in expectation. He no longer believed he could shape the direction of al-Andalus. He could only temper its edges. Khalid's consolidation accelerated in small, deliberate increments. A new directive required Christian leaders to attend major public proclamations of Muslim authority. Attendance was framed as affirmation of protection, but its symbolism was unmistakable. The bishop attended the first such gathering in Cordoba's central square. He stood among other clerics, silent, hands folded. Yusuf watched from a distance. The proclamation was brief. Sovereignty rests with Islam, Khalid declared. Protection is extended to those who fulfill their obligations. The crowd responded with approval. It was theater. Not cruel, not bloody, but theater reshapes memory. Afterward the bishop approached Yusuf quietly. "We stand," he said. "We endure." Yusuf nodded. "Endurance is survival," he replied. "But survival, under constant reminder, becomes habit," the bishop said. "Yes. And habit becomes identity." Yusuf understood. Christian communities were learning to live visibly as second. Muslim communities were learning to live visibly as first. The coexistence he had cultivated had not vanished. It had hardened. That autumn, a new report arrived from Damascus, praising al-Andalus for strengthened differentiation and orderly administration. Khalid received it with satisfaction. Yusuf read it with mixed emotion. Praise for clarity, approval for structure, acknowledgement of hierarchy. No mention of the olive groves. No mention of drought relief. No mention of negotiated restraint. Empire is practical before it is ideological, but its reports celebrate ideology. Winter came gently that year. Rain returned. Harvest stabilized. Markets swelled again with trade. And with prosperity came something unexpected. Stability. The stricter differentiation did not spark revolt. Christians adjusted. Muslims settled into clearer dominance. Conversions continued at a steady, organic pace. Not explosive, not coerced, but real. Julian, the former clerk, now managed municipal records competently. His Arabic was fluent. His faith, whatever its origins, had deepened into routine. The Berber garrisons remained restless in distant districts, but open fracture had been avoided. Yusuf rode once more to the valley where his first negotiation had taken place. The farmer still tended olives. "You have grown older," the farmer observed. "So have you," Yusuf replied. They walked between trees in silence. "You have not crushed us," the farmer said finally. "No." "You have not freed us either." "No." The farmer nodded. "Then perhaps this is how empires live." Yusuf felt the weight of that. Perhaps. Not through purity, not through equality, but through managed imbalance. As he rode back toward Cordoba, he realized something unexpected. He did not feel defeated. He felt finished. His work had been to prevent rupture in the fragile first decades. Now Andalus had thickened. Institutions had roots. Muslim authority was clearer. Christian autonomy narrower, but intact. The system no longer depended entirely on his balancing. And that meant he was no longer essential. He requested a private audience with Khalid. "I wish to step back from provincial oversight," Yusuf said calmly. "Allow younger administrators to implement your vision fully." Khalid studied him. "Is this resignation?" "It is transition." Khalid considered. "You have served effectively," he admitted, "even if I disagreed with your methods." Yusuf inclined his head. "And now?" Khalid asked. "Now," Yusuf said, "the system no longer requires constant negotiation. It requires maintenance." Khalid allowed a faint smile. "Very well." Yusuf left the palace lighter than he had felt in years. He retained advisory status, but no longer carried daily burden. In the months that followed, he observed rather than directed. He watched as differentiation normalized. He watched as coexistence settled into pattern. He watched as children grew speaking both languages without thinking about it. He watched as Christian artisans carved doors with geometric patterns beside crosses. He watched as Muslim merchants relied on Christian trade networks. Empire had not become purely ideological. It had become layered, and he understood then that the theme of his life was not triumph or failure. It was transition. He stood once more by the Guadalquivir at dusk. Bells rang. Call to prayer followed. Neither silenced the other. Both shaped the air. Empire is practical before it is ideological. And ideology, if it is to endure, must eventually accept practicality. Yusuf closed his eyes. Al-Andalus would change again. Perhaps harden further. Perhaps soften. Perhaps fracture. But for a time, because of compromise, negotiation, restraint, it had stabilized. And stabilization, in the aftermath of conquest, was no small thing. He breathed in the river air and felt something close to peace. Not because the tensions had vanished, but because he had learned to live inside them. Stepping back did not mean disappearing. It meant watching without intervening first. Yusuf moved from the center of Cordoba to a modest house near the western quarter, closer to the mixed districts where Muslim and Christian neighborhoods pressed against each other like uneasy neighbors sharing a wall. His advisory seal still carried weight, but younger men now handled daily enforcement. They were sharper in tone, quicker in correction, less patient with ambiguity. The machinery no longer creaked. It ran. From his new vantage, Yusuf observed what power looked like when it no longer feared collapse. Christian processions stayed within their assigned quarters, without protest. The shortened routes became tradition. Children grew up believing the boundaries had always existed. Church repairs required permits, but permits were granted predictably. Builders learned to prepare documents in Arabic first, Latin second. Tax categories were enforced cleanly. Conversion processes were formalized. Those who converted were integrated more smoothly now, neither over-promoted nor quietly dismissed. Differentiation had hardened, but so had habit. Yusuf realized that once rules stabilize, even restrictive ones, they begin to feel natural. Empire does not survive by erasing tension. It survives by normalizing it. One afternoon, Julian, the former clerk, visited him. "You seem quieter," Julian said. "I have fewer decisions," Yusuf replied. Julian smiled faintly. "Your compromises endure." Yusuf considered that. "They have changed," he said. "Yes," Julian agreed. "But they exist." Julian now moved comfortably in Muslim circles. His Arabic was fluent. His faith, whatever its origin, had matured into routine prayer and studied reflection. "Do you regret?" Julian asked suddenly. "Regret what?" "Allowing clarity to sharpen." Yusuf paused. "I regret nothing that prevented blood," he said. Julian nodded slowly. "Some of my old neighbors avoid me," he admitted. "That was inevitable," Yusuf replied. "Was it?" Julian asked. Yusuf met his gaze. "Yes. Conversion, coexistence, differentiation. None of them were neutral. Every shift redrew lines." That evening, Yusuf walked through the marketplace and noticed something that surprised him. Muslim merchants haggled with Christian traders without tension. Children of both communities chased one another through stalls. The cross still marked the artisan's workshop, now weathered further, but beneath it, the Arabic inscription had faded into ordinary background. It was no longer spectacle. It was infrastructure. He understood then that what had once felt fragile had become durable, not equal, not unified, but stable. Khalid's consolidation had not led to purge or revolt. It had led to hierarchy normalized. Was that better? Worse? Yusuf no longer framed it that way. He framed it in endurance. The Berber question remained unresolved at the edges, but no longer threatened the center. The governor's reports to Damascus continued to praise clarity and order. Al-Andalus had moved from conquest to consolidation, and consolidation had required both ideology and pragmatism, though rarely in equal measure. One night, Yusuf was summoned unexpectedly to the palace. Khalid received him with measured respect. "There is unrest in the north," Khalid said. Minor all. But we must send administrators. Yusuf inclined his head. You know those valleys, Khalid continued. Your approach preserved revenue there. Yusuf understood. Even ideological consolidation required practical knowledge. You wish me to advise? He asked. Yes. There was no irony in Khalid's voice, only recognition. Yusuf felt something settle inside him. He had not been discarded. He had been absorbed. Pragmatism did not vanish when ideology strengthened. It adapted. As he left the palace, he thought of the olive grove, the drought, the monastery courtyard, the cross in the market. He thought of Harith's fire and Abd al-Malik's caution. He thought of Damascus, distant and abstract, and he understood something simple. Empire is practical before it is ideological, but it must eventually be both. Too much pragmatism breeds drift. Too much ideology breeds fracture. Al-Andalus had avoided fracture, so far, because both had existed in tension, not harmony. Tension. He walked again to the river as dusk fell. The bells rang, contained but clear. The muezzin called, confident and steady. The two sounds no longer felt like opposition. They felt like structure. He did not know what future decades would bring. Rebellion, dynasty, reform, decay. But he knew this. For a generation, Muslim rule over a Christian majority had not collapsed into cruelty, nor dissolved into chaos. It had survived through negotiation, adjustment, enforcement, and occasional assertion. It had survived because administrators like him had believed that conquest required care. He breathed deeply. The work of empire was never finished, but his part in its beginning was complete. Years later, when Yusuf's beard had gone almost entirely white, he returned once more to the olive grove. Not as administrator, not as arbiter, simply as an old man who wished to measure what had endured. The farmer was gone, buried, the villagers told him, beneath the same churchyard wall where his father had rested. The grove was tended now by a son who carried the same hands, the same wary steadiness. You came before, the son said cautiously. I did, Yusuf replied. My father spoke of you. Yusuf did not ask what had been said. They walked between the trees. The harvest was modest, but steady. Irrigation channels had been repaired twice in the intervening years. Once by Muslim labor, conscripted during road maintenance. Once by Christian villagers, pooling effort. Shared necessity had a way of ignoring sermons. You still pay, Yusuf said. We still pay, the son answered. And the church? It stands. And the mosque? It grows. Yusuf nodded. Al-Andalus had changed since his early years in office. The mosque in Cordoba had expanded, its arches multiplied, its presence unmistakable. Muslim neighborhoods had thickened. Arabic had become more common in contracts, in markets, even in Christian homes. Conversions had continued, not explosive, not coerced, but steady. Some families shifted fully into the Muslim community over a generation. Others remained Christian, but adapted to new rhythms. The church had narrowed its public display, but deepened its internal discipline. Clergy had grown more careful, more organized. Bishops corresponded cautiously, aware of boundaries, but skilled in navigating them. Muslim authority had clarified itself. And yet, the grove still produced olives. Markets still required cooperation. Intermarriage, rare, but not unheard of, complicated simple narratives. Berber grievances had not vanished, but they had been partially absorbed through land redistribution and military reassignment. Khalid had governed firmly, but not foolishly. He had learned over time that spectacle exhausted itself. That revenue still mattered. That suppression, without structure, drained strength. Even Harith's fire had cooled. His sermons now spoke less of purification and more of moral conduct within established rule. Ideology had not erased pragmatism. It had incorporated it. Yusuf understood then what he had not been able to articulate when younger. Empire begins with ideology to justify conquest. It survives through practicality to sustain rule. And it stabilizes when ideology learns the limits of its own appetite. He sat beneath an olive tree and closed his eyes. He remembered the first negotiation, the drought, the monastery, the cross in the market, the green wax letter, the bishop's quiet endurance, Khalid's impatience, Harith's fire. He remembered the moment he had realized that governance was not about victory. It was about preventing collapse. The son stood nearby, waiting. Do you resent us? The son asked suddenly. Yusuf opened his eyes. For ruling, he asked. For remaining. The question struck deeper than accusation. No, Yusuf said. I have seen conquest elsewhere, he continued, where towns burn and memory is erased. That did not happen here. Not because of you alone, the son said. No, Yusuf agreed, because both sides chose survival. The son nodded slowly. We learned to live second, he said. And we learned that ruling first does not mean ruling alone, Yusuf replied. They sat in silence for a while. The bell rang in the distance. Moments later, from farther still, the call to prayer rose. The two sounds overlapped slightly, imperfectly timed, imperfectly aligned. Yusuf smiled faintly. When I was young, he said, I feared one would silence the other. And now? The son asked. Now I see that both changed. The bell shorter than before. The call more resonant than once. Neither unchanged, neither arrest. Empire is practical before it is ideological. He had spoken the phrase so many times, it had become marrow. But now he understood its other half. Ideology is necessary to begin. Practicality is necessary to continue. And humility is necessary to endure. He rose slowly, joints protesting. Al-Andalus would not remain as it was. No land ever did. Dynasties would rise and fall. Revolts would flare in distant decades. New rulers would sharpen or soften the lines he had drawn. But for a generation, his generation, the fragile reality of a Muslim minority ruling a Christian majority had not shattered into cruelty nor dissolved into rebellion. It had been negotiated, measured, maintained. He walked back toward the road as dusk deepened. Behind him, olive leaves whispered. Ahead, the city lights flickered. He did not know how history would judge him. Perhaps it would not remember him at all. Administrators rarely become legend, but legends often rest upon the work of administrators. As he approached Cordoba, the arches of the mosque silhouetted against the fading sky, he felt no triumph, only a quiet acknowledgement. Empire had not been pure. It had been practical. And that practicality, flawed, imperfect, contested, had allowed faith on both sides to survive inside power without being consumed entirely by it. The bell rang once more. The muezzin answered. Yusuf listened until both faded into night.